Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tevach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yoel HaKohen Khan Olav Hashalom, and it is in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz La'erich Yomim V'Shonim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We are at the conclusion of chapter 7 in Tanya, Perek Zayin, talking about negative energy. In the language of Chassidus and Kabbalah, klipa. Klipa means a shell that conceals and contains within it the fruit. The fruit is symbolic of Kedusha, of holiness, the purpose of creation, the divine purpose in everything that exists. The shell is the outer layer, the surface, the husk that conceals that purpose. So when a shell is doing its job properly, then it's protecting. Klipa shemer lepri. It's protecting the fruit within, it's protecting the holiness, and it's helping actually the divine purpose to be realized. So you're eating a meal, l'shem shamayim, like we learned, for the sake of heaven. So you're elevating, and the klipa is part of it, the klipas nega, the bright or the transparent klipa, the radiant klipa. But then there's sholosh klipas atmeis. There the husks are so intense and so strong that they completely conceal, or almost completely conceal, the divine within it, and it's off limits. That's called a dover osur. Osur v'kosher b'idei achitzenim. It's bound and tied up and held hostage and trapped in the forces that are the negative forces, the destructive, toxic forces of selfish existence, where the husk is an end in itself. Think of people working to make money as an end in itself, to eat just as an end in itself. So the fruit is not there. The fruit is not being focused on, so the purpose is not being realized. That's supposed to be off limits. And that's called osur b'idei achitzenim. When it's mutter, mutter means the opposite. Osur means bound. Mutter means unbound, untied, because it's free to be directed upwards, and that's what most of the things we do are involved in divrei reshus. Now, when it comes to sholosh klipas atmeis, after explaining klipas noiga, he says that is off limits. If that person is not supposed to go there, and if you do, it's unredeemable until the future when Mashiach comes, and then all the toxins will be removed, and then the fruit, the Kedusha, will emerge. But until then, it's off limits. Or through doing tshuva. But a particular tshuva, a very powerful, intense tshuva, called tshuva ma'ava, that evokes a deep passion, a deep love, a deep thirst. And that, the very thirst of the distance, has the power to extract the divine sparks, the Kedusha, the fruit, from the clutches and the tentacles of the klipa, of the negative. So let's say you're dealing with someone who's a really extremely selfish person, a narcissist. So generally speaking, a misavik manuval, you just stay away from that. You don't want to be involved in something that's toxic, because it rubs off. And when you get involved, it can start dragging you in, like sucking you in. I'm not here to talk about any individual, just speaking a concept. What's going on? The toxins are too powerful. Stay away from that. Stick to things that you have, the battles you can fight and win. Stick to things that are holiness. But let's say a person does get involved in something that is destructive. So l'osid love in the future, that will be redeemed. But even today, if indeed hitting rock bottom or that darkness can evoke in a person a level of tshuva, of ava, like you gave all the descriptions, the deep thirst and the passion and the fervor that comes from feeling so toxified, from feeling so polluted and contaminated, that has the power to extract even from those toxic tentacles of klipa. That's tshuva. So that we've learned and we reviewed. I'm just summing up what we've reviewed. Elim kin yaseh tshuva ma'avarabal. To the point, there's deinis nasalei kazachis. And then there's deinis, even deliberate sins, can be transformed to merits because, like he said, hoyel, val yodam, because through that negative experience brought you to such a level. Hoyel val yedei bo yedei bo avarabazu. But if it's not a tshuva shalema avazu, if it doesn't have such a love, Even though it's appropriate tshuva, you cannot transform it to zochis, the negatives. Okay. And then you need to rely on the future when l'asad lovi ad sheyovi ad eis kate sheyivula amovas lenetzach. In the end, when there'll come their time, and death and all negative forces will be swallowed up forever. Then the last part of the section, which we learned in the last week and two shir, he speaks about, what about bias asudis? So we talk about negative sexual behavior, inappropriate, that is forbidden. It's osir v'kosher b'dei chetzenim, relations with people that are not appropriate. There's also emitting seed to waste. So here he made a distinction. And that's the last thing we learned. There's a distinction. Even though, so he's saying, even though we said we need tshuva ma'ava, but here, because you're not, as he explained in the Haggadah that we learned last week, because you're not engaging with another person, the relations when a person is emitting seed is only between them and God, between them and their behavior. There's no other person involved, so there's no keli. In the language of the Haggadah that we learned, he says like this, because there's no nukva the klippa, there's no keli to contain, which means that even after you do the sin, there's another person involved. So you could do tshuva, but when it's bias asuris, it's like he says, then is nilka to be say the nukva the klippa, the forbidden union, the energy that you have now released in an unholy and impure way is absorbed by the female bonding, both physically and also spiritually. And that in a way traps. So even if you do tshuva, that's between you and God, but the energy has been released and is contained by another. Whereas when it comes to emitting seed wastefully, he says the energy has not been properly contained by the negative forces, even though those negative forces do have a hold on it. And actually he said in a very strong way, he says that God lavene b'bchinas agadus v'ribi atuma b'klipa shemeli demar b'me'ed me'ed b'hitzar zera levatala. But still, it's something that is not contained by another. So on one hand, in many ways it's worse. Why is it worse? Because it's not contained, so it can just, basically, its influence can flow without inhibition and restraint, as he explains. On the other hand, because it's not contained, you can easily redeem it. Through what? Through tshuva nechena, a proper tshuva, and kavon atzuma, and very intense intentions, in the Pirush HaMilas, as the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, of Krishma Shalamita. So that's an exception. So you don't need a tshuva ma'ava in this situation. You still need tshuva nechena. You still need appropriate tshuva, but you don't need that intense thing to extract because it's not been trapped by another. It's been trapped in your behavior, and as such, because it's not contained, it in a sense extends and flows without inhibition and restraint. However, because it's not trapped by another, it's easier to extract through the proper tshuva. My bias asuris, that's not that way, as he concludes. And we're going to read that and then finish the end of the chapter. He says like this, Mashenkein. Bias asuris meisiv kayev v'chayz b'klipa tmeya b'yeser. Ad she'ni yochel ha'alis misham ha'chayz b'tshuva. It goes into a much more klipat maybe, as he explains in the Haggadah, in the gloss, as we just said, because there's the keli. To the extent that ordinary repentance is not enough, does not have the power to extract the energy from there. It's been trapped. So even though it may not have the same abundance, an enormity of wasting seed, but now it's been trapped in another place, in a keli. And as such, you can't just extract it with regular tshuva. Eli imkein yasa tshuva ma'ava rabba. So this takes us back. Here, you'd need ava rabba again, that great love. Because they're holding on and clinging on to the negative forces, unless the person repents with such great love, ma'ava rabba, that his intentional sins are transformed into merits. So here's that distinction that he makes. Now, I already explained why is it so emphasizing this. There's so many different types of sins because these are very dominant ones, especially in the area of sexuality, and also Maicholas Asuras, which we began discussing and we'll be discussing in the next chapter further. Forbidden things that we eat, because these are the common things that are most contaminating and most common in our lives that affect us. Now the Alter Rebbe is going to both explain and with this explain a Maimer Razal. Ubezeh Yuvan, let's continue. This is the last lines of chapter 7. Ubezeh Yuvan Maimer Razal. With this, we can understand the teaching of our sages. And what is the teaching? Eizehu mu'uvos shelo yuchal liskain. What is a deviance that cannot be fixed? So the Lashon mu'uvos shelo yuchal liskain is from Kehelis, Aleph Tezvav, Ecclesiastes 1:15. But now the Gemara tells us in Chagiga 9a, what is this sin? What is this deviation that cannot be repaired? So he says, Zeh shabala erva v'helid mamzer. A person who had forbidden relations that caused an illegitimate child to be born. That's a mamzer. So here the Gemara says, here's what it says. Sha'oz, gamim yaset shuva, g'dele kol kach. For in that case, even if the person who sinned does a tshuva, a great repentance, he does great repentance, nevertheless, he still cannot elevate the energy to holiness. Since the energy that he released was not just like we talked earlier about emitting seed wastefully, but here has already come down into this world, it's manifest in this world and has been dressed in a body of flesh and blood. So even more, not just has there been an Ikeva, a woman, that's a Keli, but a child was born out of it. So we see from here that there's two different aspects. There's the sin the person does, the Gavra. So that, we talked about tshuva, different levels of tshuva that can work. But once something has been created, you've created damage in this world. It's not just you create damage to yourself and your behavior. You've created something, in this case a child. So why should that not be able to be redeemed? Because of this reason, like he just explained. Because you can't repair something that's already affected something outside of yourself. So this is literally consistent with what he said before about Bias Asuris. Now you see from this that the Alter Rebbe is covering the entire spectrum of every form of behavior. In chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, he talked about Gedusha and all its manifestations and ramifications. In chapters 6 and 7 so far, and then next chapter 8 will continue and conclude, he's talking about all the different elements of how negative behavior, because we're covering real life. It's not only about the pleasant things, it's even the realities of life, the uglier side, the skeletons, and the challenges and the darker corners of our lives. So he's covering it in every possible way. The things that you can redeem easier, the things that you can redeem harder to redeem, things that require tshuva nechena, appropriate tshuva, things that require tshuva ma'ava, and of course la'osad lavi, when everything will be cleaned up and all toxins will be removed. But here's where we come to the conclusion of chapter 7, where he explains very appropriately the fitting this Maimer Chazal. So the Maimer Chazal is both understood by what we learned earlier. Why is it indeed the case? Because now you've created something. There's a real keli. And it also explains, like he says, B'zev Yuvan, so now we understand the Maimer Chazal, based on what we said before. But the Maimer Chazal also helps us understand what we learned before, because it's a perfect example of this topic. And it also teaches us that our behavior is not just about us. the things we do, especially when we interact with others in areas that are forbidden, but in general, definitely in good things, all has an impact that's beyond just you and I, the person themselves. It's the impact you have in the world around you. And that cannot be minimized. So even if he repents for his own sins and is pardoned, but the child that was born out of it. Now we know there's a story with the Mittler Rebbe where a person did such tshuva and the illegitimate child actually died. So there is that concept as well that we see from that. But that clearly is a very unique and rare instance. Alter Rebbe doesn't even qualify it because that's a very particularly higher level of tshuva. One would even say higher than tshuva ma'ava, because if not, then tshuva ma'ava can correct this. And he says no. So you have to say it's a level that's even higher than tshuva ma'ava that he spoke about, even though in tshuva ma'ava itself, there can be many levels. So clearly there is that instance as well. But that's a rare occasion, a rare situation. And with that concludes chapter 7. So now let's make a little introduction and we can move on to chapter 8. The truth is chapter 8 is a direct continuation from where we are now. So even though I would begin a new share with chapter 8, but it's all right because it's a continuation. So let's keep in mind this. We've talked about shalosh klipas atmeis, things that are completely off limits. We've talked about klipas nega, things that are allowed, food, drink, things that are permitted. Speaking. So you can go in both directions. It can be elevated to Kedusha when you do it for the right sake of heaven, or you can draw it down temporarily. And then you'll need tshuva to return. But it's still davar mutter, which makes it easy to return because it's never really been bound and trapped. Even if it's temporarily there, it can be redeemed. Now, of course, in these situations, a lot is dependent on the person. But now, in chapter 8, he's going to say, there's another element when we come to my cholas asuris. In forbidden relations that we've been discussing, remember these are the two sides, bias asuris, macholas asuris. There, if the person doesn't sin, then there's nothing wrong. I mean, if a person, God forbid, has relations with someone that he's not supposed to have relations, that doesn't mean that that woman is not allowed to have relations with anyone. She has a husband, or she will have a husband. So there's nothing about her. It's just to him, for the Gavra, he's not supposed to have relations with that person. And then when he takes his energy and manifests it there, we discussed the issue. And it's far worse than it is when it's emitting seed, wasted seed. Same thing with wasted seed. Wasted seed itself, as we learned, is klipas nega. And when properly having relations with a person, with their spouse, in a sacred way, so it's directed and it's turned into Kedusha, actually, in the greatest form of holiness, giving birth to a beautiful child, a holy child, a healthy child. When it comes to macholas asuris, we have another situation here. The very object itself, independent of your behavior, is trapped in shalosh klipas atmeis. It's something that is osur b'achila. So besides the fact that you are not supposed to interact with it, it itself has a spark like that. The spark is trapped there. As we discussed earlier, that doesn't mean it could be osur b'achila, muter ba'ana, because then God has decided how the spark, it can be used for positive things. You, for example, can ride on a horse, even though horse meat is not kosher. But there's something about the object itself that is off limits. Not just relative to the person on its own. So this is what the Alter Rebbe is now going to address as he begins chapter 8. So it's a continuation because we're still talking, and the Alter Rebbe is continuing the discussion about things of klipas nega and shalosh klipas atmeis, as he'll be discussing, of what exactly is allowed, what's not allowed. As we said, it covers the entire spectrum. So here's a few more different scenarios. So he goes like this now. Chapter 8. the macholas asuris. What's the va'odzes? Furthermore. So the basic furthermore is going to be that there's something now with macholas asuris that even bias asuris doesn't have. And that is, as I just explained, that it on its own, you have the isser, the object itself is off limits to eat because there the spark is trapped there. In a forbidden relation, like I said, it's forbidden to you, but not forbidden necessarily to someone else. When it comes to Meichel Osir, everyone's forbidden from eating it. Piece of pork, God forbid. Or something else that's not kosher. Different examples that he gave earlier. So that's why he says v'odzes. You could also say v'odzes has another implication, and that is that till now we discussed a scenario of a person, something kosher being done with bad intentions. We spoke a dover mutter with bad intentions. Now he's going to also address something being done that's not kosher with good intentions. But most likely the v'odzes is coming to compare it to bias asuris, machol sashur shalakach nikroim b'shem yisur. And for this reason they're called b'shem yisur. They're called isur, chained, trapped, tied up. Mipnei she'af misha ochel meichel isur. Means they're trapped in that food. No matter what the situation is, and for every person, because even if a person inadvertently, if a person ate that food inadvertently, he ate a forbidden food for the sake of heaven. He didn't know, means he was not aware, but he ate something that was not kosher. But he ate it l'shem shamayim. He ate it in order to serve God. What's the story with that? Laved Hashem b'keich achilai, with the intention to use that food's energy to worship God. Laved Hashem. And not only was that his kavanah, v'gam pol v'osakain, but he actually did it. He actually fulfilled that intention. V'kora v'yispal b'keich achilai, and he read and davened. V'kora means usually learning. He learned Torah. He studied Torah and prayed with the power of that food's energy. B'keich achilai. So you'd think, 1 second here, what is that? That's an interesting scenario. Before we spoke about someone eating something kosher but with bad intentions or directed towards self-indulgence. What about the other way around? So here he's going to explain that here there's an element that bias asuris doesn't have, forbidden relations, and that is because of the objectivity that this chefza. So he says, so what's the story when a person does that? He says, Ein hachaya sheba oilo mislabeshes b'tzevis hateira v'atfila kamoya heter. So even though he ate it inadvertently and intended towards something of holiness, for sake of heaven, and not only intended but actually did it, nevertheless, unlike the case kamoya heter, when you're dealing with kosher food, where that is mutter, which means it's unbound, it's unchained, here the power, the energy in that food will not be uplifted. To become dressed and manifest in the words of Torah and prayer, as if it would be if he ate a kosher piece of food. Mipnei, why? Why is it the case? Because here in this case, an objective reality, this Isra Chefza, this object, is chained to the negative forces of the other side, Sitra Achre, from the three impure husks, the three impure shells. As we learned earlier, that there are things objective that God created that said this is off limits. Because the spark there is chained and trapped, and you can't elevate it. So even if you have all the good intentions, you can't elevate it. So it's independent of a person's intentions. Remember, before we learned about intentions. Intentions can work between you and God, but not when you're dealing with realities on the ground. So before we were talking about the reality on the ground was in forbidden relation with another person, and especially when it gave birth to a child, to a legitimate child. Here, he's talking about the object itself is trapped. The sparks are trapped and can't be elevated. Then he adds even further. Va'afilhu isad rabbanon. Remember, the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe, is covering all ground, covering all the bases, so to speak. Every scenario. What about a isad rabbanon? In other words, with Torah it's allowed, but the rabbanon, the rabbis, a prohibition that's rabbinic. So he's going to say, even rabbinic law, even though al pi Torah it would have been mutter, but once the rabbis forbade it, prohibited it, they have the power to also cause that the spark can no longer be elevated. That's the power of Rabbanim. And as the Alter Rebbe brings a raya to this, afilu isad Rabbanon, shechamurim divrei sofrim yeser medivrei Torah. This proves the case. Because he's saying, how could that be? We're talking about human beings. How could they have the power to trap? God created the world and can say, this is toxic, this is not toxic. This is destructive, this is not. So that we know from Chazal, the Gemara in Eruvin 21b says, Shachamurim divrei sofrim yesem divrei Torah. The words of the scribes, means the rabbis, are even more stringent than the words of the Torah. So even though on a purely firepower level, so to speak, Rabbanim don't have the Issa Daraisa. Something that Daraisa is always more a stronger statement, stronger prohibition. But nevertheless, the Torah also tells us that the Eibishter gave Rabbanon, gave the right, the Divrei Sofrim, the Rabbanon, the power for the reasons that they choose, al pi Torah. It's all divinely sanctioned, to forbid something that it becomes off limits. The Rebbe in Asiche, I remember Pesach, Tafshin Lamed Vov, 1976, discussed, can we derive from this? And he concluded that we can, that even a Issa de Rabbanon is a Issa Chefza. Because there's a discussion. Some say that Issa Daraisa says this is off limits, this is not kosher. Objectively, it's not just the person is not allowed to eat it, the thing itself. Here the Alter Rebbe wants to speak about the trap of the sparks itself, and he says even Issa de Rabbanon. So from here we can derive that Issa de Rabbanon is also Issa Chefza, and they have that power to say, or even though it wasn't off limits al pi Torah, but they say now it's off limits, so the spark is trapped there, and that's called of Osir. So as such, Ulachein gam ha'yetzer hara v'keich ha'mesavim l'dvarim ha'asurim. Who shade mishadin nuchroin. So I just wanted to read the next few lines. And because of this, when a yetzer hara is desiring it, not just the object, but the person himself also gets trapped in that place. Which is why you cannot go there and say, I'm going to elevate it to Kedusha because I'm going to use the strength from the impure, the forbidden food for something that's holy. But all of this is leading up to what we discussed earlier, another scenario where that Macholas Asuris has something that we didn't discuss till now, that it objectively is off limits and cannot be done l'shem shamayim. But we'll stop here and we'll continue next week. Always Mesayim B'Tev. The whole point of all of this is to help us learn to prevent all these things. And even if, God forbid, someone in some way may have transgressed, that we can transform it to Tshuva Ma'ava. But above all, that Mashiach should come immediately, and where all this will be erased and all the toxins will be eliminated from this world. Everyone have a good week. We're here every week. And you can go to TanyaApplied.com for previous episodes and also to submit any questions. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.